Captain Lee Hyun stood before the massive crystal dome of the Galactic Council chambers, his uniform pressed and his posture straight, despite the weight of what was about to happen. The chamber itself was a marvel of alien engineering, with surfaces that shifted between transparent crystal and solid metal, depending on the light. Around him sat the representatives of the three major galactic powers, each in their own specialized environment pods that kept them comfortable in the shared space. The Vorthak delegate Vexthara was a being of living crystal that reflected rainbow colors as she moved. Her voice came through the translation system as a series of musical tones that somehow conveyed cold disapproval. To her left, the Nimari representative existed as a swirling cloud of gas contained within a force field, speaking through chemical emissions that the computers turned into words. The Keleth delegate was perhaps the most unsettling to human eyes, a massive insect-like creature with compound eyes that tracked every movement in the room. Dr. Park Mina sat beside Lee Hyun, her tablet displaying charts and data that she had hoped would support their case. She was one of the best xenobiologists in human space, someone who had spent years studying alien cultures and trying to find common ground between species. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple style, and her face showed the strain of the past few months of negotiations. Behind them, Commander Kim Tae stood at attention with two other security officers. His presence was more ceremonial than practical, since weapons were forbidden in the council chambers, but his alert posture showed that he took his duties seriously. He had served with Lee Hyun during the border wars and trusted his captains' judgment completely. The session had begun like many others with formal greetings and the reading of agenda items. Lee Hyun had presented humanity's latest proposal for joint colonization efforts in the Outer Rim systems, worlds that other species had surveyed but deemed too difficult or expensive to settle. The human plan involved sharing both the costs and the benefits of developing these marginal worlds, bringing new resources into the galactic economy. But as Lee Hyun spoke, he could see that the alien delegates were not really listening to his words. Their attention seemed focused elsewhere, and when he finished his presentation, there was a long, uncomfortable silence. Finally, Vexathera's crystalline form shifted and caught the light in a pattern that the humans had learned meant displeasure. "Captain Lee Hyun," she said, her translated voice carrying notes of what might have been sadness or anger, "we must speak of other matters today. Your species has been the subject of much discussion in recent months." Dr. Park Mina leaned forward slightly, her scientific curiosity warring with a growing sense of unease. She had studied the body language and communication patterns of all three major species, and what she was seeing now was not promising. The Nimari delegate's gas cloud was cycling through colors that indicated stress or agitation, while the Keleth representative had begun the slow clicking sound that usually meant disagreement or hostility. "We have received many reports about human activities," continued the Keleth delegate, its voice emerging as a series of clicks and buzzes that the translation system rendered in flat, mechanical tones. "Your species continues to settle on worlds that have been classified as unsuitable for colonization. You ignore established terraforming protocols. Your population grows at rates that concern other members of this council." Lee Hyun felt his jaw tighten, but he kept his voice level. "Honored delegates, humanity has never violated any specific council regulations. We settle on worlds that other species have abandoned or deemed unworthy of development. We use methods that work for our physiology and technology base. As for our population, we are a young species still expanding to fill our potential." The Nimari delegate's gas cloud swirled faster, and its chemical voice carried what sounded like frustration. "This is exactly the problem, Captain. Your species does not seem to understand the concept of limits. There are rules that govern civilized behavior in this galaxy, standards that have been established through millennia of cooperation between mature species." "What standards?" Dr. Park Mina asked, unable to keep quiet any longer. "We have reviewed all council regulations and found no violations in our colonization efforts. If there are unwritten rules or expectations, perhaps they should be made clear to all member species." Vexathara's crystal form darkened, shifting to deeper hues that the humans had learned to associate with anger or disapproval. "Dr. Park, this is precisely the attitude that concerns us. Your species seems to believe that if something is not explicitly forbidden, then it must be permitted. You look for ways around limitations rather than accepting them. You treat the galaxy as a resource to be exploited rather than a community to be preserved. Commander Kim Tae shifted slightly behind his captain, his trained instincts picking up on the growing tension in the room. He could see that this was not going to be a normal diplomatic session, and his hand moved unconsciously toward where his weapon would normally be holstered. "Perhaps," said the Keleth delegate, "it is time to present our solution to this problem." A holographic display materialized in the center of the chamber, showing a document with text in multiple alien languages. The human translation appeared at the bottom, and Lee Hyun felt his heart sink as he read the heading. Containment Accord for Humanity. Restrictions on Expansion and Development. This document, Vexithara explained, outlines the terms under which humanity may continue as a member of this council. Your expansion will be limited to systems specifically approved by this body. All colonization efforts must follow standard terraforming protocols as established by the Namari Engineering Guild. Your population growth must be regulated to sustainable levels as determined by council economists. Most importantly, all human colonies will be subject to regular inspections and oversight by council representatives. Lee Hyun read through the terms, his expression growing darker with each paragraph. The restrictions were not just limits on human expansion, they were chains that would prevent humanity from growing, exploring, and developing as a species. Worse, the oversight provisions would essentially place human worlds under alien control. And, if we refuse these terms? He asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Then humanity will be expelled from this council, the Keleth delegate replied without emotion. You will be required to remove all human presence from council space and forbidden from returning. Dr. Park Mina stared at the document, her scientific mind racing through the implications. You're asking us to stop being human, our drive to explore, to adapt, to grow. These are fundamental parts of our nature. What you're proposing would stagnate our entire civilization. What we are proposing, Vexithara said firmly, is that humanity learns to live within civilized limits. Other species have done so for thousands of years. The galaxy is not unlimited, and resources must be carefully managed if all species are to thrive. Lee Hyun stood up slowly, his decision already made. As a military officer, he had sworn an oath to protect humanity and its interests. As a diplomat, he had hoped to find peaceful solutions to interspecies conflicts, but some compromises were simply too much to ask. Honored delegates, he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded ships in battle and led men through impossible odds. Humanity cannot and will not accept these terms. We came to the stars to grow and explore, not to be caged by those who got there first. The silence in the chamber was absolute. Even the background hum of the life support systems seemed muted as the alien delegates processed his words. Then the vote is called, Vexithara announced. All in favor of the expulsion of humanity from the Galactic Council? 3 lights appeared above the alien delegates, all glowing the same color. The vote was unanimous. Very well, Lee Hyun said, maintaining his dignity even as his world crumbled around him. Humanity will gather its people and leave Council. Space. But remember this day, honored delegates. You had the chance to guide a young species toward wisdom, and instead, you chose fear. As they left the chamber, Dr. Park Mina pulled up star charts on her tablet, looking for their destination. What she found made her blood run cold. Captain, she whispered, they're sending us to Kepler 442c. Lee Hyun looked at the data and felt a chill run down his spine. Every species that had ever attempted to establish a presence on that world had failed, usually within months. The planet was a hell of extreme weather, crushing gravity, and toxic atmosphere. It was where the Council sent species they wanted to forget about. But as he looked back at the crystal dome of the Council chambers, Lee Hyun made a silent promise. Humanity would not just survive on that hell world, they would thrive, and someday they would return to show these aliens what they had thrown away. The human fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Kepler 442 system, and Captain Lee Hyun immediately understood why the aliens called this place Death's Garden. The star itself was unstable, casting irregular bursts of radiation that would cook any ship that came too close. Three gas giants orbited in the outer system, their massive gravitational fields creating a maze of dangerous zones that had to be navigated carefully. And there, in the middle of the habitable zone, was their destination. Kepler 442c hung in space like an angry red eye, its surface covered in swirling clouds that crackled with constant lightning. The planet was larger than Earth, with gravity. That would make every step an effort. Preliminary scans showed surface temperatures that swung from freezing cold to burning hot in the span of a single day, while massive storm systems raged across continents that shook with constant earthquakes. Dr. Parkmina stood on the bridge of the colony ship New Horizon, studying the readings with a mixture of fascination and horror. "The atmospheric pressure is 3 times Earth normal," she reported to Lee Hyun, who was now serving as the expedition commander. "Humidity levels are consistently above 90%, and the chemical composition includes several compounds that are toxic to human metabolism." Commander Kim Tae was reviewing tactical data at his station, his expression grim. "Sir, I'm reading seismic activity across the entire planet. The largest earthquakes are registering at levels that would flatten any surface structure we could build." From across the bridge, engineer Song Ji-won looked up from her workstation where she had been analyzing geological surveys. She was a compact woman in her 30s with calloused hands that showed her experience working with machinery and construction systems. Her reputation for solving impossible engineering problems had earned her a place on this mission, and now she was facing the biggest challenge of her career. "Captain," she said, her voice thoughtful rather than defeated, "I think I know why the previous species failed here. They all tried to build surface colonies using standard methods. But look at these underground formations." She transferred her data to the main display, showing cross-sections of the planet's crust. Deep caverns and natural tunnel systems ran through the continental masses, some large enough to house entire cities. The geological instability that made the surface so dangerous had also created these underground spaces. "The planet's core is incredibly active," Song Ji-won continued. "All that geological activity generates enormous amounts of thermal energy. If we could tap into that power source and build our settlements underground, we could turn the planet's worst feature into our greatest advantage." Lee Hyun studied the data, his military mind already seeing the possibilities. Underground cities would be protected from the surface storms and temperature extremes. The thermal energy could power their life support systems and manufacturing facilities. Most importantly, they would be invisible to any alien observers who might be watching from orbit. "What about construction?" he asked. "How do we build underground cities when we can't even survive on the surface for more than a few hours?" Major Choi Daiho, the expedition's military strategist, had been listening to the conversation while reviewing personnel files. He was a lean man with scars on his hands from his special forces days, someone who had learned to survive in the worst conditions imaginable. "We treat this like a military operation," he said. "Short exposure rotations, redundant safety systems, and every person trained for emergency situations." Song Ji-won nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly. We start small, with just a few sealed habitats connected by tunnels. As we expand, we build better environmental controls and more sophisticated life support systems. The key is to work with the planet instead of fighting it." The first landing parties descended to the surface in heavily shielded shuttles, their crews wearing environmental suits that could keep them alive for 6 hours in the hellish conditions. Dr. Yoon Sora, the expedition's geological survey specialist, was on the first shuttle to touch down. She was a quiet woman who spoke more to her instruments than to people, but her expertise in planetary geology was unmatched. The surface of the planet was even worse than the orbital scans had suggested. The ground shook constantly under their feet, while overhead the sky flickered with lightning that never stopped. The air was so thick with moisture and chemical compounds that visibility was limited to just a few meters. Every breath had to be filtered through their suit systems, and the crushing gravity made every movement an effort. But Yoon Sora was not focused on the hostile environment around them. She was studying the rock formations and mineral deposits that surrounded their landing site. What she found exceeded even their most optimistic projections. "Captain," she reported over the communication system, her voice tight with excitement despite the difficult conditions, "the mineral composition here is unlike anything I've ever seen. The extreme pressure and temperature variations have created crystalline formations that shouldn't exist according to our normal understanding of geology. She transmitted her findings back to the fleet, showing samples that contained rare elements essential for advanced spacecraft construction. Some of the minerals she had discovered were worth more than entire star systems back in Council space. But extracting them would require mining techniques that could operate in conditions that would kill most known species. The first months on the planet were a nightmare of constant crisis and adaptation. Work crews labored around the clock to excavate the first underground chambers, while surface teams fought against equipment failures caused by the extreme environment. The humidity corroded metal components faster than they could be replaced, while the constant earthquakes caused cave-ins that buried expensive machinery under tons of rock. Major Choi Dae-ho implemented survival protocols based on military training, organizing the colonists into work teams that could function even when communications failed and life support systems broke down. Every person learned basic engineering, medical treatment, and emergency procedures. Children old enough to work were taught how to operate excavation equipment and repair environmental suits. The death toll was heavy during those first months. Toxic gas leaks claimed entire work crews when ventilation systems failed. Sudden temperature changes froze or burned anyone caught outside during shift changes. Cave-ins buried people so deep that their bodies could never be recovered. But the colonists kept working, driven by the knowledge that failure meant the extinction of human presence in the galaxy. Song Ji-won worked 18-hour days designing and redesigning their construction methods, learning from each failure and adapting their techniques to the planet's unique challenges. She developed new ways to seal tunnels against gas intrusion, created heating systems that could maintain comfortable temperatures despite the surface temperature swings, and designed excavation equipment that could operate in the high-pressure, high-humidity environment. As the months passed, the underground city began to take shape. The first permanent habitats housed 1,000 people in cramped but safe conditions. Hydroponic gardens provided fresh food, while workshops began producing replacement parts for their equipment. Most importantly, the mining operations started, producing their first shipments of rare minerals. The breakthrough came when Song Ji-won successfully tapped into one of the planet's thermal vents, creating a power source that could supply energy for the entire growing colony. The thermal energy was more reliable and abundant than any power system they had used before, and it could be accessed from multiple locations throughout their underground network. Dr. Yoon Sora made another crucial discovery during the construction of the second habitat complex. The rare minerals they were extracting could be processed using the planet's own geological forces, creating alloys and composites that were stronger and lighter than anything produced by Council technology. When formed in the extreme pressure and temperature conditions found deep in the planet's crust, these materials had properties that seemed to defy conventional physics. By the end of the first year, the colony had grown to house 10,000 people in a network of underground cities connected by pressurized transit tunnels. The surface remained as hostile as ever, but the humans had learned to ignore it completely, creating a thriving civilization in the planet's depths. Lee Hyun stood in the central plaza of the main city, watching children play in spaces carved from solid rock while their parents worked at mining and manufacturing jobs that would have been impossible on any other world. The air was clean and comfortable, recycled through biological systems that had been adapted to work with the planet's unique chemistry. Overhead, artificial lighting mimicked the day-night cycle of a normal world, helping the colonists maintain their circadian rhythms despite living underground. Commander Kim Tae approached with a report from the long-range sensor station. "Captain, we're detecting ships at the edge of the system. Council vessels, maintaining position just outside the hyperspace jump limit." Lee Hyun was not surprised. The aliens were watching, waiting for humanity to fail as every other species had failed on this world. But as he looked around at the thriving city they had built from nothing, carved from the heart of a planet that was supposed to be uninhabitable, 5 years had passed since the first humans set foot on the surface of the world they now called Inferno, and the changes went far deeper than anyone could have imagined. In the medical laboratories buried deep beneath the planet's surface, researcher Nam Junho worked with genetic samples that would have been considered impossible just a few years earlier. The small laboratory was carved from solid rock and lined with equipment that had been built from materials mined on Inferno itself. The atmospheric processors hummed quietly in the background, maintaining the perfect temperature and humidity levels needed for his work. Nam Junho was a thin man with intense eyes who had spent most of his adult life studying human genetics and adaptation. But nothing in his education had prepared him for what he was discovering now. "The bone density increases are remarkable," he said to his assistant, Dr. Lee Suman, as they reviewed the latest test results. "Children born on Inferno are developing skeletal structures that are 30% stronger than baseline human norms. Their cardiovascular systems are adapting to process oxygen more efficiently in the high-pressure environment." Dr. Lee Suman nodded as she updated their records. She was one of the few medical specialists who had volunteered to come to Inferno, driven by curiosity about how human physiology would respond to such extreme conditions. What she had found exceeded her wildest expectations. "More interesting is the heat tolerance adaptation," she added. "The genetic modifications we've introduced are being passed to the children naturally, but they're also developing additional changes that we didn't engineer. It's as if the human genome is actively adapting to this environment." Far above their laboratory, in the mining tunnels that stretched for kilometers through the planet's crust, Foreman Bei Wu Jin supervised operations. That would have been considered suicide missions on any other world. The mining teams worked in conditions where surface temperatures could reach 200 degrees Celsius, wearing environmental suits that had been redesigned dozens of times to cope with the corrosive atmosphere and crushing pressure. Bei Wu Jin was a large man with arms like tree trunks, someone who had spent 20 years in the mining industry before the expulsion from Council Space. He had volunteered for the Inferno mission because he understood that this world would require new ways of thinking about resource extraction, and he had not been disappointed. "Team 7, adjust your approach angle," he spoke into his helmet. Communicator as he watched the mining operation through multiple camera feeds. "The thermal gradient is shifting in Sector C. We need to stay ahead of the heat bloom." The mining techniques they had developed on Inferno were unlike anything used elsewhere in the galaxy. Instead of fighting against the planet's extreme conditions, they had learned to use them as tools. Thermal shock fracturing allowed them to break apart rock formations using the planet's own temperature variations. Pressure differential extraction used the atmospheric pressure changes to force rare minerals out of deep ore deposits. Most remarkably, they had discovered that some of the materials they were extracting could only be formed under the specific conditions found on Inferno. The combination of extreme pressure, high temperature, and unique chemical compositions created crystalline structures that were impossible to replicate using conventional technology. In the spacecraft construction, bays that had been carved from a series of natural caverns, Captain Shin Yunbi supervised the final assembly of humanity's first Inferno-built starship. The vessel looked nothing like the sleek designs favored by council species, appearing more like a chunk of living rock that had been shaped into aerodynamic form. Shin Eunbi was a pilot who had flown everything from atmospheric fighters to massive cargo haulers, but the ship taking shape before her represented something entirely new. The hull was forged from materials that had been crystallized in Inferno's thermal vents, creating armor that was harder than anything in known space. The internal structure used biomechanical principles that had been discovered while studying how life could survive in the planet's underground ecosystems. "Final systems check complete," reported her chief engineer, a woman named Kim Dahya, who had redesigned half of their manufacturing processes during the construction project. "The fusion drive is operating at 112% of theoretical efficiency, and the hull is showing stress tolerances that are off our measurement scales." The ship's engines were perhaps the most remarkable innovation. Instead of using standard antimatter or fusion reactions, they burned crystallized atmospheric compounds that could only be produced in Inferno's unique environment. The energy output was higher than conventional drives, while the fuel was literally harvested from the air around them. Dr. Park Mina had been busy with her own projects during these 5 years, working from a communications center that maintained contact with the galaxy beyond Inferno. Her xenobiology expertise had proven invaluable in an unexpected way, helping humanity reach out to species that had been marginalized or expelled by the Council. "We're receiving another request for settlement assistance," she reported to Lee Hyun during one of their weekly status meetings. "The Threx Confederation wants to establish a colony on Kepler 438b, but they need our help with the environmental adaptation." The Threx had been expelled from Council space for being too aggressive in their expansion policies, though Dr. Park Mina's research suggested they were simply more direct in their communication style than the Council species preferred. Their request for help was one of dozens that had been received from various alien groups who had heard about humanity's success on Inferno. "What about the Zephyrians?" Lee Hyun asked, reviewing the list of pending requests on his tablet. "They're particularly interesting," Dr. Park Mina replied. "The Council classified them as technologically primitive because they don't use standard galactic technology. But their bioengineering capabilities are actually more advanced than our own in some areas. They could teach us a lot about sustainable life support systems." The first test flight of the Inferno-built starship took place on a day when the planet's surface storms were particularly violent, with lightning strikes occurring every few seconds and winds that could flatten buildings. Captain Shin Yunbi strapped herself into the pilot's seat, surrounded by displays that showed environmental readings that would have terrified pilots from more civilized worlds. "All stations report ready," she announced over the ship's communication system. "Beginning launch sequence in 30 seconds. The ship lifted off from the underground launch bay using repulsor fields that had been adapted from Council technology, but powered by Inferno's thermal energy. As it rose through the planet's atmosphere, the hull temperature climbed to levels that would have destroyed conventional spacecraft materials, but the crystallized armor held without showing any stress. Breaking through into orbit, Shin Yunbi felt a moment of pure joy as she saw the stars spread out before her. For 5 years, humanity had been trapped on the surface of one world, cut off from the galaxy that had rejected them. Now they had the means to reach out and reclaim their place among the stars. The ship's performance exceeded all expectations. In space, the Inferno-forged hull proved to be nearly invisible to most scanning technologies, while the unconventional engine design allowed for maneuvers that would have been impossible with standard drives. Most importantly, the ship's systems were designed to operate in extreme environments, making it capable of missions that no Council vessel could attempt. Back on the planet's surface, Major Choi Dae-ho was training the first generation of Inferno-born humans in combat techniques that took advantage of their enhanced physiology. The young people who had grown up on the Hellworld were stronger, faster, and more resilient than baseline humans, with reflexes adapted to an environment where a moment's hesitation could mean death. "Remember," he told the trainees as they practiced in a chamber where the gravity was set to twice Earth normal, "your advantage is not just physical. You've grown up in conditions that would kill most other species. Use that knowledge." The training scenarios he had developed were based on the unique challenges of their environment. Combat in zero visibility during surface storms, fighting while wearing full environmental suits, and tactical operations in the maze-like tunnel systems that connected their cities. The skills being developed would give human forces capabilities that no other military in the galaxy could match. Song Ji-won had expanded her engineering projects beyond the underground cities, designing transit systems that connected their settlements across entire continents. The magnetic levitation trains ran through sealed tunnels that used the planet's own magnetic field fluctuations for power, creating a transportation network that was faster and more efficient than anything found on conventional worlds. "We're ready to begin construction on the Southern Continent complex," she reported to Lee Hyun. "The geological surveys show massive mineral deposits that could support a population of 50,000 with thermal energy sources that could power industrial operations on a scale we've never attempted before." As the 5th anniversary of their arrival approached, Lee Hyun stood in his office overlooking the central plaza of New Seoul, the underground city that had become the capital of human civilization on Inferno. 10 years after humanity's expulsion from the Galactic Council, Admiral Ko Sun-ho commanded a fleet unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. His flagship, the Resilience, hung in space above the Hellworld of Titan's Forge, where humans and their alien allies had established the seventh colony in what was now being called the Free Worlds Alliance. The Resilience was built entirely from materials forged in the depths of Hellworlds, its hull a dark metallic substance that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The ship's design incorporated lessons learned from operating in the most extreme environments imaginable, with systems that could function inside stellar radiation zones, navigate through asteroid fields moving at relativistic speeds, and operate within the gravitational wells of binary star systems. Admiral Ko Sun-ho was a compact man with silver hair and eyes that had seen too much, someone who had risen through the ranks during humanity's darkest hours and emerged as one of their most capable commanders. He stood on the bridge of his ship, watching as construction crews worked on the orbital stations that would serve the growing colony below. "Admiral," reported his tactical officer, Lieutenant Commander Yu Jina. "We're receiving another communication. Request from the Council fleet in the Proxima system. They want to arrange a meeting to discuss territorial boundaries." Ko Sun-ho studied the tactical display showing Council ship positions throughout the local sector. For the past 2 years, alien vessels had been appearing with increasing frequency in systems that had previously been considered worthless, trying to establish monitoring stations and research outposts in areas where humans were operating. "Tell them we'll consider their request," he said calmly, "after they demonstrate they can survive a week on the surface of any world in our territory." The challenge was not meant to be cruel, but it highlighted the fundamental difference between human civilization and the Council species. Humans had learned to thrive in conditions that would kill other species within hours, turning their greatest weaknesses into unmatched advantages. On the planet below, Ambassador Lim Yujin was meeting with representatives of the latest species to join the Free Worlds Alliance. The conference room had been carved from solid rock deep beneath the surface, where temperatures stable and the crushing gravity of Titan's Forge was partially offset by artificial gravity fields. Ambassador Lim Yujin was an elegant woman in her 40s who had spent years studying diplomatic protocols and alien psychology before the expulsion. What she had learned on the Hellworlds had changed her approach completely, replacing formal negotiations with practical demonstrations of mutual benefit. "The Corvani bring exceptional biotechnology to our alliance," she explained to the assembled delegates, referring to a species that had been classified as genetically unstable by the Council. "Their ability to adapt biological systems to extreme environments will help us establish colonies on worlds that even we have found challenging." The Corvani representative was a tall, thin humanoid with skin that shifted color based on environmental conditions. Their species had been expelled from Council space because their rapid genetic adaptation was considered dangerous by the more static alien civilizations. But on Hellworlds, where adaptation was essential for survival, their abilities were invaluable. "We are honored to contribute," the Corvani delegate replied in accented but clear human speech. "Your people have shown us that strength comes from embracing change rather than fearing it." In another part of the same complex, General Ryu Minho reviewed tactical reports from across human space, planning military operations that would have been impossible for any conventional force. His war room was filled with three-dimensional displays showing stellar phenomena that most species avoided at all costs. General Ryu Minho was a lean man with scars on his face from the early days on Inferno, someone who had learned that traditional military thinking had no place in the environments where humans now operated. His forces were trained to fight in places where other species couldn't even survive, using the galaxy's most hostile regions as both sanctuary and weapon. Intelligence. Reports indicate that the Council is developing new long-range sensors, reported his intelligence chief, Colonel Park Ji-hoon. "They're trying to monitor our activities without getting close enough to put their ships at risk." "Let them monitor," Ryu Minho replied, studying deployment patterns across a dozen Hellworld systems. "By the time they see what we're doing, we'll already be 3 steps ahead." Human military doctrine had evolved far beyond conventional space combat. Their ships were designed to operate inside nebulae where sensor systems failed and hull armor was corroded by exotic particles. They could hide within the coronas of unstable stars, using stellar radiation as camouflage while their inferno-forged hulls remained intact. Most remarkably, they had learned to fight within the gravitational wells of neutron stars and black holes, using relativistic effects as tactical advantages. The transformation of human society went beyond military capabilities. Dr. Yoon Sora, now the chief geologist for the Free Worlds Alliance, had established research stations on 17 different Hellworlds, each one teaching humanity new ways to extract resources from impossible environments. "The mineral formations on HFY are unlike anything we've discovered," she reported during a Science Council meeting broadcast across the Alliance networks. "The combination of tidal forces from 3 different moons and the planet's molten core has created crystalline structures that exist in a state of constant molecular flux. These materials, when properly harvested and processed, created technologies that seem to violate known laws of physics. Armor that became stronger when exposed to energy weapons, engines that increased efficiency under extreme stress, and computing systems that functioned better in high-radiation environments than in normal space." The economic implications were staggering. Resources that had been considered impossibly difficult to obtain were now flowing from Hellworld mining operations to manufacturing centers throughout the Free Worlds Alliance. Species that had been struggling to maintain basic technology levels found themselves with access to materials and equipment that surpassed anything produced by the Council. Captain Shin Yunbi, now commanding a squadron of Inferno-class vessels, led exploration missions into regions of space that had been marked as permanently off-limits by galactic cartographers. Her ships moved through zones where background radiation would kill unprotected crew members in minutes, where gravitational anomalies could tear apart conventional vessels, and where the very fabric of space-time was distorted by exotic phenomena. "We're detecting artificial structures in the Omega Centauri cluster," she reported during a routine exploration mission. "Someone built installations inside the accretion disk of the central black hole, but they've been abandoned for thousands of years." These discoveries were becoming increasingly common as human exploration pushed into regions that other species had never dared to investigate. The galaxy was much larger and stranger than anyone had realized, filled with wonders and resources that had remained hidden because they existed in environments too hostile for conventional exploration. Back on Inferno, the original human colony had grown into a sprawling metropolis that housed over 500,000 people in underground cities that stretched across 3 continents. The planet's surface remained as hostile as ever, but the humans no longer even noticed the constant storms and temperature extremes happening above their heads. Nam Junho, now director of human adaptation research, had made discoveries that were revolutionizing their understanding of biological development. Children born on Hellworlds were not just physically stronger and more resilient, they were developing cognitive abilities that allowed them to process complex environmental data instinctively. "The neural development patterns we're seeing suggest that the human brain is adapting to handle multiple environmental stressors simultaneously," he explained to a gathering of researchers from across the Alliance. "These young people can navigate in zero visibility while monitoring atmospheric composition, seismic activity, and thermal gradients all at the same time." The first major confrontation with Council forces came when a Vorthak exploration fleet attempted to establish a research station in the Kepler 186 system, where humans had been mining resources from the magnetosphere of a gas giant. The Council ships maintained what they considered a safe distance, but their presence was detected immediately by human sensor networks. Admiral Ko Sunho responded by moving his fleet into positions that should have been impossible to achieve. His ships approached the gas giant through its radiation belts, using the charged particle streams as cover while their hulls absorbed energy levels that would have overloaded conventional shielding systems. "Vorthak vessels," he broadcast on an open channel. "You are operating in Free World's Alliance territory without authorization. Withdraw immediately or demonstrate your ability to survive in this environment." The alien response came in the form of a tactical scan, followed by immediate withdrawal when their sensors detected human ships operating inside the planet's magnetosphere. The energy levels in that region were sufficient to sterilize the surface of a small moon. 20 years after their expulsion from galactic civilization, President Han Minji stood in the command center of New Seoul, watching as the most powerful fleet in known space prepared for what might be the most important meeting in galactic history. The underground city had grown beyond all recognition, its tunnels and chambers now extending deep into Inferno's mantle, where the pressure and temperature would crush any visitor not adapted to Hellworld conditions. President Han Minji was a woman who had never expected to hold political office, having spent her early career as a systems engineer before being elected to lead the Free World's Alliance. Her presidency was not based on political connections or diplomatic experience, but on her proven ability to solve impossible problems and her deep understanding of what humanity had become. The fleet assembling in orbit was commanded by Fleet Admiral John Seulgi, a veteran of the early Hellworld expeditions, who now controlled more firepower than any military commander in galactic history. Her ships were marvels of technology that existed in a constant state of controlled crisis, designed to operate at the very edge of destruction while maintaining capabilities that exceeded anything the Council had ever produced. "Madam President," Admiral Jeon Selgi reported through the quantum communication system that connected all human worlds. "The Council delegation has arrived at the edge of our territory. They're requesting safe passage to the meeting location." The meeting was to take place on Tartarus, a world so hostile that it existed inside the corona of an unstable star. Surface temperatures reached levels that would vaporize most metals, while radiation levels fluctuated wildly as stellar flares erupted from the nearby sun. It was exactly the kind of environment where humans now felt completely comfortable. "Grant them passage," President Han Minji decided. "But remind them that we cannot guarantee their safety once they enter the stellar radiation zone. Their ships will need to prove they can survive the approach." Science Director Kang Hyok watched the Council fleet's approach from his research station orbiting Tartarus, monitoring their ship's performance as they entered the increasingly hostile environment. The alien vessels were using maximum shielding and following the safest possible trajectory, but their energy systems were already showing signs of stress. Science Director Kang Hyok was a thin man with prematurely gray hair who had spent 2 decades pushing the boundaries of what was scientifically possible. His research teams had developed technologies that seemed to violate fundamental laws of physics, creating materials and systems that could only function under the extreme conditions found on Hellworlds. "Their power consumption is increasing exponentially," he observed, watching the telemetry data from the approaching ships. "At this rate, they'll need to shut down non-essential systems just to maintain life support." In contrast, the human ships escorting the Council delegation were actually gaining energy as they approached the star. Their hulls absorbed and converted the stellar radiation into usable power, while their crystallized armor became stronger and more resilient under the extreme conditions. The meeting itself took place in a conference facility that had been carved from solid rock inside Tartarus's largest mountain, where the stellar radiation was partially blocked, but temperatures still reached levels that would be fatal to most species. The human delegates wore standard clothing while their alien counterparts were encased in full environmental suits that made communication difficult. Admiral Lee Hyun entered the conference room as the senior human representative, his appearance largely unchanged despite the passage of 2 decades. The Hellworlds had been kind to human physiology, extending lifespans and improving health in ways that medical science was still struggling to explain. Across from him sat Vex Thara, the same Vorthak delegate who had pronounced humanity's expulsion 20 years earlier. Her crystalline form was contained within a protective field that kept her isolated from the deadly environment, while translation equipment struggled to process her communications through the interference. "Admiral Lee Hyun," she said, her voice carrying undertones that suggested both respect and fear. "The Council wishes to discuss the current situation in galactic space. Your expansion has created complications that require diplomatic resolution." Lee Hyun smiled politely as he reviewed the formal documents that had been transmitted ahead of the meeting. The Council was requesting humanity's return to galactic civilization, but under terms that were vastly different from the restrictions they had tried to impose 20 years earlier. "The Council offers full membership status," continued the Keleth representative, its insectoid form barely visible within its environmental protection system. "All human worlds would be recognized as sovereign territory, with no restrictions on expansion or development. In exchange, we request access to your resource extraction technologies and assistance with developing colonies in extreme environments." The offer was remarkable in its scope. The same species that had expelled humanity for being too aggressive and expansionist were now asking for help with their own expansion efforts. Economic reports showed that Council space was facing resource shortages as their conventional mining, and manufacturing operations struggled to meet growing demand. "We appreciate the Council's offer," Lee Hyun replied, his tone diplomatically neutral. "However, humanity is no longer the same species you expelled 2 decades ago. We have evolved beyond your current understanding of what civilization means." Demonstrate his point, he activated a holographic display showing the current extent of the Free Worlds Alliance. 57 star systems were now under human control or protection, many of them containing worlds that had been classified as permanently uninhabitable by galactic science. Dr. Park Mina, now serving as the Alliance's chief diplomatic advisor, provided additional context about their current capabilities. "Our mining operations extract resources from environments where Council technology cannot function. Our manufacturing facilities operate inside stellar coronas and planetary cores. Our cities exist in places where your species cannot survive even with full life support systems." The most startling revelation came when Science Director Kang Hyuk presented data on human technological development. Ships that traveled through black hole ergospheres, harvesting energy from the rotation of space-time itself. Manufacturing processes that use the pressure at planetary cores to create materials with impossible properties. Computing systems that operated using quantum fluctuations in the fabric of reality. "Your technologies," observed the Nimari representative, its gaseous form swirling with what appeared to be confusion, "violate several established principles of physics." "Your physics," corrected Kang Hyuk gently. "We've learned that the universe is much stranger and more flexible than your species believed. When you live in environments that should be impossible, you discover that impossibility is just another engineering challenge." The negotiations continued for 3 days, with the Council delegates struggling to adapt to conditions that the humans found comfortable. Several times, alien representatives had to return to their ships for medical treatment as their environmental systems failed under the stress of the hostile environment. President Han Minji joined the talks on the final day, bringing with her a proposal that would reshape galactic civilization. Instead of humanity rejoining the Council, she offered to establish a new framework for interstellar cooperation based on adaptation and growth rather than limitation and control. "The Free Worlds Alliance welcomes any species willing to prove. They can survive and thrive in challenging environments," she explained. "But membership requires demonstration of capability, not just diplomatic credentials." The test she proposed was simple in concept, but terrifying in practice. Any species seeking to join the Alliance would need to establish a successful colony on a hellworld of humanity's choosing, using their own technology and resources, but with human guidance and support. "This is what we're offering the Council. President Han Minji continued. Full partnership in an alliance that controls resources and technologies beyond your current capabilities. But you'll need to prove you're strong enough to earn that partnership. The response from the council delegates was immediate and unanimous. They requested time to consider the proposal and consult with their home governments. The meeting concluded with agreements for additional negotiations and cultural exchange programs, but no firm commitments from either side. As the council fleet departed, struggling through the stellar radiation zone that human ships navigated, effortlessly, Admiral Lee Hyun received reports from across human space. 3 new species had requested admission to the Free Worlds Alliance in the past month, while human exploration fleets had discovered potentially habitable worlds in star systems that had been considered empty by galactic surveys. Fleet. Admiral Jeon Seulgi stood beside him on the observation deck of the Tartarus station, watching the alien ships retreat to what they considered safe distance. Her expression mixed satisfaction with anticipation for what was to come. "They'll be back," she predicted. "Their resource shortages are getting worse, and we control access to materials they can't obtain anywhere else." "When they return," Lee Hyun replied,